Imagine a group of 17th century dissenters huddled in a cold London cellar or an Amsterdam warehouse, performing an act so radical it was considered both a theological heresy and a political crime: the baptism of a conscious adult. In an age where your religion was determined by your monarch and your citizenship was tied to your infant christening, these Baptists were not just changing a ritual, they were declaring an insurrection of the soul. They dared to suggest that the king had no business in the conscience, and that a true church was not a building or a national boundary, but a voluntary gathering of the redeemed. This spark of defiance traveled across the Atlantic, finding a jagged and fertile home in the American colonies. It is a story of extreme contradictions, a movement that birthed the American concept of religious liberty while simultaneously fracturing over the moral crisis of slavery. A tradition that champions the absolute autonomy of the local church while building some of the largest global missionary machines in history. To trace the progression of Baptist denominations in America is to witness the architectural drafting of the American religious mind. A relentless, often messy pursuit of a faith that is personal, uncoerced, and perpetually reforming. The Baptist tradition in America is not a monolithic entity, but rather a complex, living tapestry woven from threads of radical dissent, theological rigor, and a relentless pursuit of soul liberty. To understand the modern landscape of Baptist denominations is to look back at a movement that catalyzed through centuries of tension, emerging from the shadow of the Protestant Reformation and the specific pressures of English religious nonconformity. This identity was never merely about the mode of a ritual. It was a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between the individual, the church, and the state. In the American context, this progression was marked by a series of transformative ruptures and consolidations. What began as a scattered collection of dissenters in the 17th century evolved into a dominant cultural force by the 19th, only to be fractured by the same systemic sins, most notably slavery, that divided the nation. The Baptist story is thus a narrative of expansion through diversification, where deep-seated convictions regarding the local church's autonomy and the priesthood of all believers provided both the fuel for explosive growth and the mechanism for perpetual schism. By examining the historical progression from English roots to the contemporary regional and theological realignments, one uncovers a tradition that has consistently prioritized the individual conscience over ecclesiastical hierarchy, forever altering the American religious and political landscape. The genesis of the Baptist movement is inextricably linked to the seismic shifts of the Protestant Reformation. In the early 17th century, the European religious landscape remained in a state of volatile transition. While the initial reformers had successfully challenged Roman Catholic hegemony, a new generation of dissenters felt the English Reformation had remained incomplete, stalled by a Church of England that retained too many popish vestiges and a stifling proximity to monarchical power. Early Baptist pioneers did not merely seek minor liturgical adjustments. They sought a restoration of the primitive church as they perceived it in the New Testament. This was an era of profound doctrinal confusion, yet it served as the fertile soil for a distinct theological emphasis: the conviction that the church should be composed exclusively of voluntary regenerated believers. By insisting on believers' baptism, these early figures effectively dismantled the medieval synthesis of church and society, arguing that faith could never be inherited or coerced by the state, but must be personally confessed. The formal crystallization of Baptist practice is often traced to 1609 and the radical actions of John Smith. A former minister in the Church of England, Smith's journey toward dissent was driven by an increasing dissatisfaction with the state church model. To Smith, if the Church of England was a false church, then its baptisms, specifically infant baptisms, were invalid. In an act that shocked his contemporaries and redefined ecclesiastical boundaries, Smith rebaptized himself and then his followers in Amsterdam. This sea baptism was not a gesture of vanity, but a theological necessity born of the belief that a true church must be founded upon a new covenant of conscious faith. By rejecting the baptism of infants, Smith and his small congregation in Holland were asserting that the church is a gathered body of the saints, governed not by a distant bishop, but by the local congregation under the direct kingship of Christ. While Smith provided the initial spark, Thomas Helwys became the architect of the movement's most enduring political legacy, the defense of universal religious toleration. Helwys's theological development was forged in the heat of controversy. After Smythe moved toward Waterlander Mennonite views, Helwys broke away, leading a small group back to English soil in 1612 to establish the First Baptist congregation in London. Helwys's seminal work, A Short Declaration of the Mystery of Iniquity, 1612, represented a revolutionary leap in political theology. He argued that the king's authority was strictly civil and that no earthly ruler had the right to judge the souls of men. Crucially, Helwys did not just demand liberty for his own kind, he insisted that the state must allow heretics, Turks, or Jews to follow their consciences. This uncompromising stance led to his imprisonment and likely his death in Newgate Prison, but it established the liberty of conscience as a non-negotiable Baptist distinctive. In contrast, the particular Baptists emerged slightly later, grounded in a robust Calvinism that sought to align Baptist practice with the theological depth of the Westminster tradition. They maintained that Christ's death was intended for a particular group, the elect, and that God's sovereign grace was the sole factor in salvation. While General Baptists initially had a head start, the particular Baptists would eventually exert a much more profound influence on the long-term belief structures of the denomination. The definitive codification of this theology is found in the Second London Baptist Confession. It was only after the Act of Toleration in 1689 that messengers from over 100 congregations met to formally subscribe to and publish the work. By identifying it as the 1689 Confession, Baptists were not just adopting a creed, they were announcing their legal right to exist and their commitment to a Lord of the conscience who stood above any earthly king. This landmark document provided the theological backbone for the Philadelphia Association and eventually the conservative core of American Baptist life. Despite their sharp disagreements over predestination, both branches of the movement were united by a shared theological axiom, the absolute kingship of Jesus Christ over his church. This was not a mere abstract concept, it had practical, radical implications for church life. If Christ was the king, then every believer who identified with him through baptism shared in his roles as prophet, priest, and king. Every member was empowered and bound to bear public testimony to the truth. No human mediator was required. Each believer enjoyed direct access to God. The power of the church resided in the local body of believers, who were collectively responsible for governance and discipline. This egalitarian spirit allowed the Baptist movement to survive and even thrive during the intense persecutions following the restoration of the British monarchy in 1660. By the time the Act of Toleration was passed in 1689, Baptists had not only worked out their theology, but had also demonstrated a resilience that would soon be tested in the vast frontiers of the American colonies. The transfer of Baptist identity to America was not a simple relocation. It was an acceleration of the diversification that began in England. Early colonial Baptists mirrored the divisions of their motherland. New England was largely home to General Baptists, while the Mid-Atlantic region saw a higher concentration of particular Calvinist Baptists. However, the American experience added a new dimension to the Baptist struggle, the frontier. The seemingly limitless space of the New World offered an escape from the rigid past and fostered a united front against the religious establishments of the colonies. In the New World, being a Baptist became less about fine-tuning one's view of the atonement and more about an active, often dangerous resistance to state-mandated religion. This environment set the stage for the emergence of leaders who would take the English seeds of religious liberty and plant them in the very foundation of a new nation. The transition of Baptist ideals from the relative confinement of English descent to the expansive potential of the American colonies found its most radical expression in the life and labors of Roger Williams. Williams was not merely a pioneer. He was a theological provocateur whose vision for the relationship between the sacred and the secular predated the Enlightenment by a century. His contribution to the American experiment was grounded in the conviction that for faith to be authentic, it must be entirely uncoerced by the machinery of the state. Following his 1635 banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for articulating new and dangerous opinions regarding the limits of civil authority, William sought sanctuary among the Narragansett people, an Algonquian-speaking sovereign nation whose hospitality proved essential to his survival. In a move that challenged the very legality of European colonialism, Williams rejected the claim of the English crown to indigenous soil, instead recognizing the inherent rights of the Narragansett by formally purchasing the land at the head of the bay. There he established a frontier sanctuary he named Providence, which would serve as the foundational seed for the colony of Rhode Island. It was within this unique civil framework in 1639 that he assisted in organizing the First Baptist Church in America. Although Williams's personal tenure in the congregation lasted only months, as he transitioned into a seeker, convinced that the true primitive church had yet to be fully restored, the seismic impact of this first gathered body established a permanent blueprint for a faith entirely divorced from state coercion. Under his leadership, the fledgling colony of Rhode Island became a sanctuary for those the rest of the world deemed heretics. Williams did not merely tolerate diversity, he structured the social infrastructure of the colony around the radical principle that God requireth not an uniformity of religion. This was not a sign of theological indifference. Williams remained a staunch, reformed separatist, but rather a recognition that civil power has no legitimate authority over the human soul. This lively experiment proved that a stable society could exist without a state-mandated church, a concept that would eventually move from the rogue colony of Rhode Island to the very heart of the American Constitution. While in London in 1644 to secure a parliamentary charter for his colony, Williams published his most influential work, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. In this treatise, he argued that the New Testament had fundamentally altered the judicial laws of Israel. To Williams, the ancient kingdom of Israel was a temporary type that was fulfilled in the spiritual kingdom of Christ. Therefore, no modern nation could claim to be a new Israel entitled to enforce religious orthodoxy through the sword. This wall of separation, a metaphor Williams coined long before Thomas Jefferson, was intended to protect the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. By ensuring that Jews, Quakers, and even those with no faith at all could live as full citizens, Williams established Rhode Island as a laboratory for soul freedom. The principles established by Williams found new champions during the crucible of the American Revolution. Isaac Backus emerged as the preeminent Baptist voice of the late 18th century, linking the struggle for political independence with the struggle for religious disestablishment. Backus argued that state-enforced religion was not only a violation of the soul, but the greatest form of tyranny known to man, inevitably leading to corruption and the spread of infidelity. Following in his footsteps, John Leland took the Baptist message to Virginia, where he labored for 15 years. Leland was a vibrant, bold preacher who believed that the state's only duty regarding religion was to leave it alone. His tireless advocacy was instrumental in the passage of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and served as a vital influence on the eventual drafting of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Baptist trajectory in America began as a radical, persecuted movement, but through its persistent commitment to religious disestablishment, it became the largest Protestant denomination in the nation. This trajectory was defined not by uniformity, but by perpetual reform and diversification. Yet this rapid growth also embedded internal contradictions. The same convictions regarding local church autonomy and individual conscience that fueled the movement would be tested to the breaking point by the defining moral crisis of the nation: slavery. To understand the modern landscape of Baptist denominations is to look back at a movement catalyzed through centuries of tension, prioritizing the individual conscience over ecclesiastical hierarchy, and forever altering the American religious and political landscape. At the dawn of the 1700s, the Baptist presence in America was marginal, consisting of roughly 24 scattered churches with fewer than 900 members. However, by the end of the century, they had transformed into the largest denomination in the country. This explosive growth was fueled by the First Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that fundamentally reshaped Baptist identity and outreach. The revivals of the 1740s challenged the spiritual lethargy that many complained had characterized colonial religion. While not initiated by Baptists, the movement became its chief beneficiary by prioritizing personal, heartfelt conversion over formal ritual. This shift replaced bitter quarrels over trifles with a renewed vigor for evangelism and a commitment to planting new churches in the expanding frontier. The awakening also introduced new divisions within the movement. Regular Baptists. These were the original core, predominantly Calvinistic and centered in the Mid-Atlantic region. Initially, they were wary of the excesses and emotional evangelistic practices of the revival. Separate Baptists. This group emerged from New England Congregationalists who embraced both the revival spirit and adult baptism. They were more spontaneous and often at odds with the more structured regular Baptists. Eventually, particularly in the South, these two streams would merge, creating a potent evangelical style that combined Reformed theology with revivalist zeal. As the movement grew, the need for cooperation became apparent. The Philadelphia Baptist Association, formed in 1707, became the most significant organizational body for early American Baptists. In 1742, it adopted a confession of faith that solidified a moderate Calvinism as the denominational standard. This association provided a framework for church planting, education, including the founding of a Baptist college in 1764, and a unified voice in the struggle for religious liberty. The expansion of the American frontier acted as an accelerator for Baptist growth. In an environment characterized by social fluidity and a rejection of old-world hierarchies, the Baptist emphasis on the local church's autonomy and the kingship of all believers held immense appeal. By 1790, the movement had grown to nearly 1,000 churches and 67,000 members, organized into 42 associations. The Baptists were no longer a small sect of dissenters. They were becoming the dominant religious force of a new nation. The turn of the 19th century introduced a period of unprecedented momentum that transitioned the Baptist movement from a collection of loosely affiliated churches into a structured national force. This era was defined by the Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious fervor that traded the intellectualism of previous eras for a populist, experiential faith that resonated deeply with a young nation pushing westward. The camp meeting phenomenon became the primary vehicle for this expansion. In rural outposts like Cane Ridge, Kentucky, tens of thousands gathered for multi-day open-air services. These events bypassed traditional church structures, emphasizing a direct, emotional encounter with the divine. For Baptists, this environment was ideal. Their lack of a rigid hierarchy and their reliance on bivocational farmer preachers allowed them to move as fast as the frontier itself. By 1812, the number of Baptists in the U.S. climbed to nearly 200,000, with a significant concentration in the southern and western states. Despite their fierce commitment to local church autonomy, a principle often held as high as biblical authority, Baptists recognized that global and national goals required collective action. The catalyst for this shift was the burgeoning interest in foreign missions. In 1814, delegates met in Philadelphia to form the General Missionary Convention, commonly known as the Triennial Convention because it convened every 3 years. This was a landmark moment. For the first time, American Baptists had a national platform. This body did not just fund missionaries, it created a sense of denominational consciousness that transcended state lines. However, this newfound unity was fragile. While the Triennial Convention focused on overseas work, the formation of the American Baptist Home Mission Society in 1832 began to reveal regional friction, as Southern members felt that resources were being funneled primarily toward Northern expansion. As the mainstream Baptist body moved toward institutionalization, several reactionary movements emerged. These groups were not looking for progress. They were looking for restoration, seeking to strip away what they saw as modern, human-made corruptions of the New Testament model. The primitive or old-school Baptist movement arose as a direct protest against the rise of missionary societies and Sunday schools. Grounded in a strict Calvinism, they argued that if God intended to save the elect, he did not need human-made societies or boards to do so. They rejected formal organization, favoring a simple, unadorned worship style characterized by a cappella singing and the practice of foot washing. Simultaneously, a movement known as landmarkism began to stir within the Southern Baptist ranks. Led by figures like J.R. Graves, landmarkers asserted that Baptist churches were not Protestant because they had never been part of the Catholic Church to begin with. Instead, they claimed an unbroken succession of local Baptist-like churches dating back to the time of John the Baptist. This high church Baptist view had significant practical consequences. A closed communion. Only members of a local Baptist church could partake in the Lord's Supper. A rejection of alien immersion. They refused to recognize baptisms performed by any non-Baptist minister. Ecclesiological isolation. They viewed other Christian denominations not as churches, but as mere religious societies.